The first great question that early Christians faced among themselves was, who exactly was Jesus? Was he a human being? Was he divine? Was he some combination of the two? And if he was some combination of the two, what is the relationship between the divine and the human in Jesus? Last time I talked about the fact that there was a group called the Docetists who believed that Jesus was just completely divine, didn't even have a human body. Then there were the Ebionites who said, no, Jesus is a human. He's certainly special to God and was adopted by God and appointed by God, but he was just a human. And then there were a whole lot of people in between that said, no, Jesus is divine and he's human in some combination. We got to figure out what it is. Well, one of the people who tried to figure out what it was in the 3rd century, well, early 4th century, was a guy by the name of Arius. And Arius was a priest in Alexandria, Egypt. And Arius said, okay, here's what I think is a relationship between the divine and the human in Christ. He said, I think that Jesus was the first created being. So there was God by himself, and then Jesus was the first created being, the first thing that God created, and then God used Jesus as an instrument in creation for the rest of the universe, right? And he thought that that made perfectly good sense and that it fit in well with the Gospels. I mean, the Gospel of John talks about in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, and the Word refers to Jesus. So he said, yeah, it fits in with that perfectly. Well, his bishop and many other people did not agree with him, although he won some converts. And so this was one of the main points of contention at the Council of Nicaea in the year 325. It was to try to settle this question, what's the relationship between the divine and the human in Jesus? Well, the Council of Nicaea ruled that Arius was wrong, that Jesus was not a created being, and to emphasize this, they created a creed, the Nicene Creed it came to be called, and in the Nicene Creed it says specifically that Jesus is the Son of God, the only begotten of the Father, of the substance of the Father, God of God, light of light, very God of very God, begotten, not made. So there's the slap against Arius, begotten, not made, being of one substance with the Father. Now, this word of one substance is a Greek word. I'm going to write it up here in English. Homoousios. This means of the same substance or the same essence as the Father. So the Father and the Son, God the Father and Jesus Christ were of the same substance, whatever exactly that means. Okay, so that was the official position of the Council of Nicaea. Well, not everybody accepted it. A lot of people signed it. Not everybody really completely accepted it. There were many who said, well, now you're using a word that has been used by other heretics earlier on, and I'm not going to get into that story, but it was a word that was used by people who held beliefs that weren't considered to be correct. And there were people who said, well, what we need to do is we need to add a letter. We need to add, let me find a different color here. We need to add the letter I right here. So instead of homoousios, it should be homoiousios. Jesus is of a similar substance to the Father. In other words, Jesus is similar to the Father, and we just won't define it any further. Well, this change that happened after the Council of Nicaea set off a series of wars after Constantine died. He had 3 sons that he split his empire among, and 2 of the sons believed the homoiousios interpretation. The other son believed the homoousios interpretation, and they fought with one another over this letter I. Well, there was more to it than that, but that was ostensibly the reason for many of the battles. In fact, one of the earliest Germanic tribes to be converted to Christianity were called the Goths. They didn't wear black clothes and things like that. That's a later thing. But the Goths converted to Christianity, but they were converted to a homoiousios form of Christianity. And so as Christianity spread among the Germanic tribes, many of them adopted this, what some would consider aberrant form of Christianity. So, what is Orthodox and what is heterodox? What is orthodoxy and what is heresy? Well, this was all. There was other councils after the Council of Nicaea that tried to continue debating the issues, and they swung back and forth. They didn't go back. They didn't actually ever adopt homoousios, but they adopted a meaning, an understanding of homoousios that wasn't quite the same as as some of the early proponents of it thought it should be. So they went back and forth. Finally, there was another council in the year 451, the Council of Chalcedon, and this created the official position of the Orthodox Church, defining orthodoxy as being that, when you're talking about Jesus anyways, and the relationship between the divine and the human in Jesus, Jesus was fully human and fully divine, without confusion, without mutability, without division, without separation. Well, not everybody accepted that. Most people did, but there were some Christian groups, notable Christian groups, like the Coptic Orthodox Church, that said, no, we don't agree with this, and they split off, and they have maintained to this day their slight distinction in understanding. There was another group that split off earlier, a group that came to be known as the Nestorians because of their leader Nestorius. They split off earlier from the after the Council of Ephesus in 431. But at any rate, orthodoxy now was defined. Not everybody accepted it, but the vast majority of people did. Now I want to talk about a couple of people that are very important in the development of the early history of Christianity anyways. The first is Augustine. He was the greatest Christian thinker in the post-Constantinian era. So after the Emperor Constantine, the first Christian emperor, died, Augustine was probably the greatest Christian thinker for at least the next 800 years or so. He developed the doctrine of the Trinity. He didn't come up with the word, first of all, but he developed the doctrine, fleshed it out, defined as three persons in one substance. Remember the one substance, right? Homoousios, one substance, although he wrote in Latin, not in Greek. And he wrote a book called The City of God, right on the eve of some of the Germanic tribes overrunning the Western Roman Empire, and even the city of Hippo, where he lived. Barbarian tribes, as they were called, were about to overrun the city. And he thought that, well, Christianity has been accepted by the Roman emperors, and now it's going to be destroyed by these barbarians. Little did he know that these barbarians, as he thought of them, were being converted to Christianity, and they were going to establish a Christian empire in Rome, or in Europe, that would be even larger than the Roman Empire. But he didn't know that when he died in the year 430. Perhaps Augustine's greatest work, most important work, the one that's read the most anyways, is an autobiography that he wrote, maybe the first great autobiography ever written anywhere in the world. It was called Confessions, and it's written as though it were a prayer to God, but it's a confession. It's confessions of Augustine's life, and it begins with this statement, not the very beginning, but in the first section: "Our heart is unquiet until it finds rest in you." So Augustine says to God, we don't have any peace in our hearts until we find peace in you. So he was Augustine was an early Christian thinker who was very influential throughout the Middle Ages, which was to come about shortly after Augustine's death. People date the beginning of the Middle Ages variously, but one convenient way to date it is with the fall of the Western Roman Empire to the Germanic tribes. The last Roman emperor in the West was overthrown in 476. Now, I've mentioned Constantine way back in 330 had moved the capital from Rome to the east to the city of Byzantium, which he renamed in his own honor, Constantinople, the city of Constantine. And Constantinople remained the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire. it remained the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire for about 1,000 years, until the year 1453. So, but in the West, the Roman Empire fell, and these Germanic tribes took over, but they very quickly became converted to Christianity. I said that the Goths were converted to a homoousios form of Christianity. The first group of Germanic tribes, the Germanic tribes, to convert to what we might call an Orthodox Christianity was the Franks, under their leader Clovis, and that he converted in the year 496. And the Franks were more powerful than the other Germanic tribes, and they defeated them. And when they defeated them, guess what? The other tribes accepted the Franks' version of Christianity. So before too long, this homoousios version of Christianity was gone. And all that was left was the Orthodox version of the Nicene Creed. Clovis's greatest successor as king of the Franks was a guy by the name of Charlemagne, who was crowned Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire on Christmas Day in the year 800. Well, it wasn't called the Holy Roman Empire yet, but it became the predecessor of the Holy Roman Empire. All right, so that's what's going on in the West. In the East, you have the Byzantine Empire that was not overthrown by the barbarian Germanic tribes. They survived for another almost 1,000 years. The greatest of the Byzantine emperors was a guy by the name of Justinian. The Emperor Justinian reigned beginning in the year 527. He reigned almost 40 years. And he was so successful that he began expanding his territory to the west. He conquered Sicily. He conquered the southern part of Italy. He almost conquered Rome, not quite, but he was trying to reclaim the boundaries of the old Roman Empire, west as well as east. He conquered all of North Africa as well. But it was not to last, and the Byzantines were not able to hold on to it. And of course, after the rise of Islam, which we'll talk about next week, much of this land was lost to the Arabs and the Muslim converts. Well, Christianity was the dominant power now in the East, in modern-day Turkey, and Egypt, and Israel, Palestine, that area today, and also in most of Western Europe, into Central Europe. It took longer to get into Northern Europe, and also in parts of North Africa, all along the Mediterranean coast. The predominant religion was Christianity. Let's talk a little bit about monasticism. I said last time that when the great persecutions broke out against Christians, some people went to the desert to flee away from the persecutions, but some went to the deserts as well to flee what they saw as corruption within the church. They believed that the church was getting too lax in the cities. The only way to live a truly Christian life was to be out in the desert by yourself. And there are many of these so-called desert saints, desert fathers and mothers, who went out and lived by themselves or in very small communities. One of the most famous of these was a guy named Anthony, St. Anthony, he came to be known as, St. Anthony of Egypt. Now, this is not the same guy that San Antonio was named after. That's Anthony of Padua. So St. Anthony of Egypt lived 85 years in the desert. He died at the age of 105, so he lived out there for a good long time. Athanasius, whom I've mentioned before, wrote a biography of St. Anthony, and this biography spread, and people were just captured by this idea of living a monastic life. There was a guy by the name of Simeon Stylites, who was one of these desert saints. Simeon Stylites. And I should say that this monastic movement continued long after Christianity became a legal empire and even the favored and official religion of the Roman Empire. Simeon Stylites lived on a pillar. That's what the Stylites part of his name means, Simeon who sat on a pole. Simeon Stylites lived for 37 years on a pillar outside of the city of Aleppo. And, it was like, 15 feet up high in the air. And then so many people came to see him that he had his disciples build a taller pole, and he just moved the platform that he lived on further up high. And he had disciples who would give him food, and when he needed to do his business, he just did it over the edge and lived there for 37 years. And he was considered very wise. People came and sought his advice on things. Even emperors came out to visit him. So that's sort of an extreme form of monasticism. That sort of extreme form kind of died out for obvious reasons. But people living by themselves, gradually this was transformed into people living in communities. And so people who lived in these communities followed very strict rules, such as rules written by St. Benedict and St. Basil the Great. And there were various different orders and monasteries that were founded. And the nice thing about a monastery is now you don't have to live in the desert. You had to go out in the desert if you wanted to be by yourself. You had to go where there were no people. Not the desert per se, but wilderness areas. But with monasteries, you could build a monastery in Italy or France. Just put walls up around it, and you were isolated from the world. And so monasteries became the big movement within monasticism, starting around around the 5th century or so. Yeah. And then in the 13th century, you see a new movement within monasticism. People had been living in monasteries now for centuries, Christians had been, and there were some Christians who said, well, we'd like to have a monastic order where we have a rule to follow, and we give up all our worldly goods, but we actually work in the world and do good things in the world. And the first two of these orders, they're called the mendicant orders. Mendicant means those who beg, and because they would often beg for their food and people would give them food. When we get to Jainism, you'll see that Jain monks are often mendicants as well. Well, the first two mendicant orders were the Franciscans, founded by Francis of Assisi, and the Dominicans, followed by St. Dominic. And they arose during the 13th century, and then later, in the 16th century, they were joined by the Jesuits. These are orders of monks and nuns. There are female counterparts to them as well, that live in an order, but they don't live inside a monastery. They may live in a single house, but they go out into the world, and they do things like teach or preach or minister to the poor or whatever. They live in the world. Okay. Another institution that arose fairly early on in Christianity was the papacy. And the history of the papacy is a fascinating history, and I don't have anywhere near enough time to talk about the entire history of the papacy, but let me just hit a few highlights. The word pope in English comes from the Italian word papa, which means father, just like it does in Spanish. And the Pope was considered to be the father of the church. The Pope, the word Pope is equivalent to saying the Bishop of Rome. So the first Bishop of Rome, according to Roman Catholic tradition, is Peter, one of the 12 disciples. Although, as I said, the Church of Rome was actually around before Peter. But still, Peter and Paul are seen as the founding fathers of Rome, and Peter is identified as the first pope, succeeded by people like Clement and Linus and various others, Anacletus, various others early on. So early on in the city of Rome, there was actually not a single leader. The city of Rome had so many Christians that there were several different leaders of the church, and they seem to have operated in sort of a collegial arrangement where they all sort of made joint decisions, but eventually the tradition arose to have a single leader of the Church of Rome. And the first bishop who's really worthy of the title of Pope, as opposed to just being Bishop of Rome, was a guy named Leo the Great. Pope Leo I, he was Pope from 440 to 461, and the reason he is called the Great, and the reason he's considered by many to be the first real Pope in the sense of exerting his authority, was that Leo claimed to be over not only the other priests of Rome, the other bishops around him in Rome, he claimed to be over the entire church of the West and East alike. So not only the church in Rome and in France and in Germany, they weren't called that yet, but also in Alexandria in Egypt, and in Antioch in Syria, and in Jerusalem. Well, the bishops in the East didn't like his presumption, and they said, no, you can be the leader of the East of the Western churches. We accept that, but we have our own leaders as well, and you are a great leader, but we have great leaders in the East too. Well, after the city of Rome fell to the barbarians in 476, there weren't any more great leaders for a while, anyways, in the West, not any great political leaders, and it often fell to the popes in Rome to take on the mantle of political leadership as well as spiritual leadership. One of the first of these was Gregory the Great, who was a former officer in the Roman army, and he basically took over the city of Rome and ruled it as it was kind of like a mayor. He distributed food to the poor and things like this. He lived he ruled from 590 to 604. He was also a reformer of Christian liturgy. If you've ever heard of Gregorian chants, they're named after Gregory the Great. There are other great reformers among the popes. Pope Gregory VII in the 11th century, Pope Boniface VIII in the 13th and 14th centuries. They asserted more and more power for themselves, power of the papacy. Early on, there was a lot of these church councils, and they continued to have church councils from time to time, but eventually the popes became more powerful than the church councils. The church councils were seen as only advisory to the pope. Now, not everybody agreed with that, but the popes were very powerful. They had their own standing army. And so Pope Boniface VIII, whom I mentioned a minute ago, in the 13th century, he said that outside the Church of Rome there was no salvation, and that every person in the world should be subject to the Pope. I should say that that Dante Alighieri, who wrote the Divine Comedy, was not a fan of Pope Boniface VIII, and in his story, The Divine Comedy, he put Pope Boniface VIII in the eighth circle of hell among the simoniacs, that is, those who bought their power, the power of God for money, or sold the power of God for money, either one. So, at any rate, the papacy is an interesting institution that has been reformed over the years. For years, it was only, for more than 1,000 years, everyone who was Bishop of Rome had to be Italian. And this ceased with Pope John Paul II, who was from Poland, and then Pope Benedict was from Germany, and Pope Francis, the current Pope, is from Argentina. So the tradition of being Italian is no longer being followed, but we talked before about traditions and what does it take to break a tradition. I guess it took a Pope like John Paul II, who is the second longest reigning Pope. He reigned for something like 25 years. So anyways, history of the papacy, very interesting. And a very important institution in the West. Also, it sort of provided a springboard for the Protestant Reformation under Martin Luther, because Luther had conflict with the Pope at the time, and there was more than one Pope, other popes at the time. And so this led, in a way, to the Protestant Reformation. It also led to something called the Great Schism, which was a split between the Eastern and the Western churches, or between what we call today the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. This happened in the year 1054. The churches in the East and the West had different liturgical languages, Latin in the West, Greek in the East, and they had different cultures. They had, as it turns out, the bishops in the East, the leaders in the West, had changed the Nicene Creed. They had inserted a couple of words in there, well, one word in Latin. That's called filioque. You can look that one up, the filioque clause. And when the Eastern Church found out about it, it made them so incensed, and they were also mad that the Pope was trying to say that everybody in the East had to follow the Pope, that the Archbishop, the Patriarch of Constantinople, excommunicated the Pope, and the Pope turned around and excommunicated the Archbishop, or the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the two churches have been separate ever since. So for the last 1,000 years almost, the two churches have been separated. The schism has never been officially healed, although the mutual anathemas or curses that they laid on each other have been lifted in recent years. And I'm going to call a stop here, and I'll come back and finish up talking about Christianity in the next video.